What's going on?
Begin.
We are chapter 5, page 50. Reshuta Umot ve'ezratan. Permission of the nations and their help. The Ramban, in the end of his commentary on Shir HaShirim, describes how the redemption of Israel will begin, how it will be that they will return to their land. Source 1, the Rambam on Shir HaShirim, which was written 700 years before, approximately before the Balfour Declaration, 800 years ago. Chapter 8, verse 13. Uverishayon malchei ha'umot uve'ezratan. And it will be with the permission of the nations of the world and with their help. Yelchu le'eretz Yisrael k'dichtiv. They will go back to the land of Israel, as it says. Veheviu et kol achechem mikol hagoyim. And they will bring all of their brothers from all of the nations. It's Pasuk in Yeshaya 66:20. V'hachi halacho tahi nimshach ve'enu posek leolam. And that kingdom will continue forever, and it will never be interrupted. All right. So 700 years ago, before the Balfour Declaration in the 17th of Cheshvan, 1918, or the decision of at San Remo of the League of Nations in the summer of 1919, the Ramban knew to say that our return to the land of Israel, would be with the permission of the nations and with their help. That the nations would be brought through various, their own political mechanisms, so to speak, to decide that the Jews are supposed to return to Eretz Israel. The Balfour Declaration was the statement of the British government against, of course, Lord Balfour to Lord Rothschild, that His Majesty's government views with favor the establishment of a national home for the Jews in Palestine, as long as it does not impinge upon the rights of other people. That's the basic paraphrasing of the very short declaration. San Remo was the conference establishing the League of Nations, and there the League of Nations gave the mandate over Palestine to Britain so that they could foster the development of a Jewish national home. Based upon this principle, the many Gedolei Yisrael throughout the generations have said that the nations of the world are going to give us permission to return to Eretz Yisrael. In this chapter, we're going to collect a few of these opinions. The Radak, one of the most prominent commentaries on Nach, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim, that lived in the same time period as the Ramban, writes in his commentary on Psalms 146:3. Al tivtechu b'nedivim v'ven adam she'en lo teshua. Do not trust in the gifts of man, in lords, in man that does not have the power to save. That's the verse in Psalms that the Radak is commenting on. She'im lo b'ratzon ha'el, if it will not be by the will of God. Ein biad adam lahoshia chavero mitzarato. No man has the ability to save his friend from his difficulties. Ki la'Hashem levado hatshua, because it belongs to God alone, the salvation. V'hu yisovavena al yedei b'nei adam. And God brings about his salvation through the use of man. Kamosh Sobev Shua Galut Babel Al Yidei Koresh, just like he brought about the salvation from the exile in Babylon through Koresh, the king of Paras. V'ken la'atid Yisovev Gulot Yisrael Al Yidei Melchei Hagoyim. So too in the future, God will bring about the redemption of the Jews through the kings of the world. Shi'or et rucham l'sholcham, that they will be awakened, their spirit will be awakened to send the Jews back to their land. Salvation surely comes from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, from the Holy One, blessed be He. But He brings it about so that it comes to fruition through mankind. The Radak even brings a historical example for this, and that is the salvation of Israel from the Babylonian exile through Koresh, the king of Paras. As it says in Yeshayahu, Ko amar Hashem l'mashicho, thus says God to his anointed one, l'Koresh, to Koresh, asher hechazakti v'mino, that I have strengthened his right hand, etc. And the Navi goes on to say that the point of this was that the Jews should be returned to their land. The Radak relates also to the future, and he establishes that this will also be the nature of the future redemption, that it will be through the waking of the kings of the world. Similarly, Rabbeinu Bachai, 600 years ago, 600 years before the Balfour Declaration, approximately 700 years ago now, wrote on his commentary to Parshat Toldot. Kshenitka'imu habrachot liYaakov, when the brachot that were given to Yaakov Vinu, Shu Shlishi La'avot, who is the third of the forefathers, Yesh lanu b'zeh haftacha gedola b'galutenu hashlishi. We have a great guarantee for us in our third exile, which is the exile of Edom, which was prefaced by the exile in Egypt and the exile in Babylonia. Shi'itkaimu banu bizman hagula, that will be fulfilled for us in the time of the redemption. V'kashem shematzinu shesaro shel Esav iskim al brachot shnemar v'yavarach oto sham. As we see that the angel of Esav agreed to the brachot that were given to Yaakov Avinu, that he dropped his claim that they were stolen from him, when it says, V'yavarach oto sham, that when the angel of Esav fights with Yaakov Avinu all night long, as Yaakov Avinu is returning to Eretz Yisrael, in the end, when he cannot overcome him, the angel of Esav can only make Yaakov Avinu limp. He says he has to return because it's dawn and it's time for him to sing songs to God. And Yaakov Avinu only agrees to release him if he will bless him. And it says that the angel blessed him there. Ki bizman hagula atidim malchei hagoyim sheyaskimu b'birchotenu. So too it will be at the time of the redemption that the kings of the nations will agree to our blessings. V'hu shehivtichenu hanavi, and this is what the prophet guaranteed us. Vayu malachim amanecha sarotehem minikiyotecha, and their kings will be faithful to you, and their princes will nurse you. Apaim eretz yishtachavu lecha, their faces they will prostrate to the ground to you. Vafa reglecha yilachechu, and the dust of your feet they will lick. Ve'yadata ki ani Hashem, and you will know that I am God, asher lo yivoshu koibecha, that those that hope in me, in God, will never be embarrassed. Even at the time when the idea of real Zionism, practical Zionism, began to take root and began to function in the last few generations, 120, 140 years, our rabbis related to this point Rav Tzvi Hirsch Kalischer, as we learned in the very beginning, was one of the founders of the idea of a political Zionism, wrote in his Sefer, Terishat Zion, in Tav Kuf Tzadi Vav. This is 1836, more than 150 years ago. Ki reshit hagula al yidei hitorut ruach nedivim ve'al yidei ratzon hamalchuyot. The beginning of the redemption will be through the waking of the spirits of the lords, aristocrats, kings, and so on, and through ve'al yidei ratzon malchuyot lekabetz me'at meni pizurei Yisrael la'admat kodesh, and through the desire of the nations or the kingdoms to gather the few remnant of the scattered people of Israel onto the Holy Land. These words are repeated by Rav Alkalai in Kitvei Rav Alkalai. Gulat Yisrael tiye al yidei malchei haaretz. The redemption of the Jews will be through the kings of the land. Kshivakshu Yisrael me'et malchei haaretz. And it will be when Israel asks for the help of the nations. HaKadosh Baruch Hu yashlim v'yeta et libam lasot bakashatam. God will complete their hearts and lean them, incline them to do their to respond to their petitions and requests. And Rav Alkalai explains this in another place even more so. Rishayon hamalchut hu reshit kol. The permission of the nations is the first thing. Bikurei kol. It is the first fruits of everything. Ulefi ruach hazman hazeh. Shemalchei Europa hem malchei chesed v'rachamim yoter mimalchei hakedem. And in our time, when we see that the kings of Europe are kings of grace and compassion more than in past times, or more than the kings of the East, mehem nisig et rishayon techila. We will get the permission from them first. Malchut Britannia, Tzarfat, Austria. The kings of Britain, France, and Austria. Mehem yetzmiach keren Yeshua. From them will sprout the foundations of the horn of salvation, the beginning of salvation. An interesting thing, if you think about this, Britain and France were clearly more enlightened than the others. Germany was not yet united. Rav Alkalai lived in what's today Yugoslavia, was part of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, and he was certainly referring to that. When you think of Malchei Kedem, the kings, it can be either kings of the East or kings of the past. If you want to look back at previous kings, there were, unending persecutions throughout the history of the Jews that certainly people in the mid-1800s, as various liberal movements were spreading through Europe, felt that the era of great anti-Semitism was over, certainly in Central Europe, Western Europe. He may be comparing himself, as I said, to the past, or he may be comparing himself to Tsarist Russia, where the Cantonist system was just coming into being. The Tsar proclaimed the Pale of Settlement were only in certain areas of the Russian Empire Jews could live, which caused great hardship. They could only work at certain things, and also a very large number of Jewish boys would be drafted into the Russian army, and have to do a very, very long service there. 20 years was the norm. And they were generally drafted between the ages of 8 and 10, something like that. There is an entire literature from the time, because when these people would be released, they knew they were Jews, but they had essentially grown up in the Tsar's army, if they survived at all. And when they returned to the Jewish community, how did we know that they were Jewish or not? It's very interesting. Rav Yosef Dov Halevi Soloveitchik, the Rav of Brisk, the Rav's great-great-grandfather, wrote that if they speak Yiddish, we know they're Jews, because they didn't know how to do anything. They didn't know how to daven. They didn't know how to put on tefillin. They were basically completely and totally ignorant of Judaism, but they wanted to be Jews because that's what they were. They had been prosecuted so much. So it's unclear to me which of these two things he's talking about when he's talking about Malchei HaKedem. I want to add one thing, that Golda Meir talks about her grandfather, that he was one of these boys that was drafted by the Tsar. And her grandfather, when he was in the army, for the 20 years that he was forced to serve in the Tsar's army, he only ate bread and uncooked fruits and vegetables, so he wouldn't eat anything that wasn't kosher. And after he was released from the army, he slept, except for Shabbos and Yom Tov, he always slept on the bench in Shul to atone for the fact that he might have eaten something treif when he was in the army. Golda Meir wrote, I believe in 2 different places, that if she was ever able to accomplish something from the Jewish people, it was in the zechut of her grandfather, who conducted himself in this way. Similar things are written by the Sakhachover Rebbe, Rabbi Shmuel Bornstein, the author of the Shem Shmuel, and Rabbi Rue Chelik Aleph, page 106. The Sakhachover Rebbe, is about 150, 200 years ago, and from the Hasidic viewpoint. The Kamosh Nimtza L'Ketzat Rishonim Zal, and just as we find in some of the Rishonim, Shekamo B'Bayit Sheni Nifgedu Yisrael Al Yedei Koresh Melech Paras She'avir Kol B'Chol Malchuto, just like we find in the construction of the Second Temple, that Israel was commanded by Koresh, the king of Persia, to make an announcement throughout his kingdom. Mi bechem mikol amo yeh elokavimo. Whoever among his nation, his God is with him, he should go up and rebuild the temple. What's interesting is this is very similar, if you think about it, to the call that was made after the Jews worshipped Avodah Zarah in the desert. Mi la Hashem elai, whoever who is God should come to me. Kach tieh techilat ge'ulat ha'atida, she'Hashem yitbarach yiten b'lev malchut ha'aretz. So too it will be in the beginning of the future redemption, that God will put in the hearts of the kingdoms of the world, livchor lanu et nachalatenu, that we should choose our inheritance. Al ken chov kodesh mutal aleinu, litorer gamken, and at that point it will be a holy obligation upon us to also waken up. Ulahachin et levavenu, and to prepare our hearts, elav yitbarach shemo, to him, the Holy One, is his name should be blessed. Velasot gam anachnu mitzidenu kvi yocholotenu b'chomer u'ruach, and we should do whatever we are capable of doing, both physically and spiritually. V'higia ha'et legeshet el hamlacha, and the time has come to draw near to the work. L'ha'erbot ha'yishuv be'artzenu ha'kadosha, to increase the settlement in our holy land. Al pi ruach haTorah ve'amitzvot, according to the spirit of the Torah and its mitzvot. It's interesting the way he phrases this, that the time has come that we should do it. We're beginning to see the hints of such an allowance, is what he's talking about in his time, and therefore we should do it in the proper way. Also, the Malbim, in his letter to Rav Kalisher, wrote similar things. B'tchila yityashev anashim mibnei Yisrael be'eretz Yisrael, b'rishayon malchei haaretz hayesharim v'chasidim. And in the beginning of the settlement of people from Bnei Yisrael in Eretz Yisrael, it will be with the permission of the kings of the land that are straight and pious. Yishuv Eretz Yisrael kodem bias HaMashiach, and the settlement of Eretz Yisrael will be before the coming of Mashiach. When we look back, we can testify that this is exactly what happened. First, we were given the Balfour Declaration that was written while the First World War was still going on, where it gives the British government's statement that we view favorably the establishment of a national homeland for the Jewish people in the land of Israel. And afterwards, about a year afterwards, this was accepted by a declaration of the League of Nations at San Remo to return the land of Israel to the people of Israel. And 30 years after that, also interesting, the 17th of Kislev, 1947, excuse me, Jewish year is Tafshin Chet. After the Second World War, we have the same declaration from the United Nations that Israel, about the establishment of the state of Israel. The reason why I say it's interesting is the 17th is of the month, which was both the Balfour Declaration in the Hebrew month, the Balfour Declaration, and the decision of the United Nations to allow the establishment of the state of Israel. They're both on the 17th of the month, and the gematria of 17 is Tov, is good. It is important to remember that the decisions of the nations, of the United Nations, was the result of the two great powers, the East and the West, came together on this decision. The West, led by the United States, and the East, headed by the Soviet Union. They didn't agree on anything at that time. They were fighting over almost every single issue. They would fight just for the sake of fighting. But on this issue, both the United States and the Soviet Union both agreed to the establishment of the State of Israel. This is truly a divine act for the redemption of Israel. This is a divine command that we see coming into existence. And we see that our rabbis, the early ones, the Rishonim and the Achronim, wrote about this long before it actually happened. It's also interesting to note, I mean, especially as American Jewry today views, and the AIPAC always talks about how, the United States was always the great ally and supporter of Israel and so on. That's really not true. It was the Soviet Union, through the Czechs that were part of the Eastern Bloc at the time that supplied Israel with arms in 48. The United States was very active in supporting the United Nations boycott and bringing in the United Nations boycott onto all parties to the Middle East conflict. And the United States brought pressure on Great Britain to observe this blockade, which prevented her from rearming the Egyptians and the Jordanians during the various truces that occurred during the war, which allowed Israel to get the upper hand because the Czechoslovakia was ignoring it, and it allowed Israel to bring in great amounts of arms. And the United States pressure on Israel in 56 forced her to withdraw from the Sinai, getting absolutely nothing in return. So it was only after the 67 war that the United States truly developed as an Israeli ally. Here it was more a cold ally. The American State Department was convinced that we needed to be friends with the Arab countries because of oil, and they were also convinced that Israel, with its socialist leadership, would naturally fall into the Eastern Bloc. And in fact, that was the same thoughts were going on in the Kremlin, that because of the socialist nature of the leadership of the Yishuv, that Israel would naturally become a part of the Soviet bloc. And as the Arab Middle East at that point was in the Western sphere of influence, the Soviets viewed Israel as a way of getting into the Middle East. You see how everything changes over time. Rav Soloveitchik writes similarly in his essay, Kol Dodi Dofek, that my beloved is knocking on the door. Kami pamim tefak hadod bepetach ohel rayato. How many times did the beloved knock on the doorway of the tent of his partner? Reshit tevikat hadod nishma b'maracha politit. At first, the knocking on the door of the beloved is heard in the political realm. Mibechinat yachasin haben leumim, in the international political sphere. Lo yakhish afish, no man can deny, shetikumat medinat Yisrael b'muvan politi, that the establishment of the state of Israel in the political manner, haita hitrachashut kimat al-tivit, is an occurrence that is above nature, is beyond nature. Russia v'artzot hamarav tamchu yachad b'rayon yisodo shel medinat Yisrael. Russia and the Western countries together supported the idea of the establishment of the State of Israel. I should say that France voted in favor in the United Nations of the establishment of the State of Israel, and Great Britain abstained. Shaita ulai ha'atzah ha'yechida shebenogea la hitachdu hamizrach ve'amarav. Perhaps this is the only thing in which the East and the West were unified on. Note ani lahamin she'irgun ha'umot ha'miyuchadot notzar b'yichud l'tachlit zu. I am inclined to believe that the establishment of the United Nations was created specifically for this purpose. L'shem milui hashlichut she'itilu alav ha'hashgacha, to fulfill the mission that divine providence placed upon it. Nidmeli, it appears to me, wrote the Rav, she'en lahatzbiya al shum hayisag mamashi acher al yidei ha'um, that there is no great thing, important thing that the United Nations did. Im poloni almoni patach et yeshiva shel umot miyuchadot lo hayta nolda medinat Yisrael. If these people had not opened up the United Nations, perhaps the State of Israel would not have been born. Aval im hadod tofek b'shulchan hanesiut. But if the beloved knocks on the table of the presidency, Yitzrachesh hapela. So, a wonder occurs. Kol dodi dofek, that my beloved knocks at the door. The Rav is saying that perhaps he is inclined to believe that the establishment of the United Nations was so that the resolution voting for the establishment of the State of Israel could be passed. It's a very interesting statement. And he's saying almost everything else that the United Nations did has had no real impact in the world. I think he's stretching the point, or perhaps he's saying, the Korean War was to a certain extent a result of the United Nations. But if the United Nations had not existed, it is quite likely that something like the Korean War would have happened essentially the same way it did, meaning the West would have still, even if the United Nations had not existed, defended what they viewed as their interests in preserving a Western allied South Korea, although at the time it wasn't a democracy at all. It was also a dictatorship. Similarly, in the same way the United States defended South Vietnam, which was also a dictatorship. But we can see that these things could have happened regardless of the United Nations. And he's saying only the establishment of the State of Israel, which was something upon which the East and the West came together, could have occurred only through the existence of the United Nations. This is the end of the parak. We'll pick up the next parak next week.